Hey, what's up? My name is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. In this video, I want to show you how you can compress your HTML and your CSS for Tailwind projects. Now that's a bit of a misnomer in two ways. Number one, for HTML, I'm just going to show you how to do that with a build tool that I used for this project called ViteJS. Whatever build tool you're using, you'll need to find your own way to minify it using their system of plugins and whatever, but I can only show you what I did with this project. Number two, I'm going to show you how to compress the CSS using something with PostCSS, which you can use with any build system you want, and it doesn't even have to be, obviously, with Tailwind. Any kind of CSS file can reference this if you just have PostCSS installed. So with those caveats out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. I did this video earlier in the week where I showed you how to set up this whole landing page, so if you're interested in that, go ahead and check that out. You'll notice over here on the left, though, that the way I style my Tailwind classes is just like I would write my CSS. So I actually just write it in line like this and do new lines. And that helps me just kind of mentally be in the same space as I would be if I were writing the CSS out myself. So how can we compress this so that when I come over here and inspect the final build, it doesn't look like this? Well, that's what I'm going to show you how to do with ViteJS. Now, like I said, if you are using a different build tool for the way you've constructed your project, you'll need to look into their own system. But for here, for Vite, I'll show you how to do that quickly. There is a plugin you can use, and you can see that there's a bunch of plugins for Vite. But in this one here, it tells you that you can compress the HTML. We're going to keep this real simple. So all I'm going to do is install it just like this. And let's actually open up another terminal here. And I used PNPM in this, so I'm going to do the same thing. Actually, let's give ourselves a little bit more room. So with PNPM here, I'll go Vite plugin HTML with a capital D flag, which is the same thing as saying -- save dev. So now that we've got that set up, I'm going to come down here and there's a bunch of things you can do with this, but you're going to see that by default, all I'm really wanting to do is minifying this and saying minify true. Now that we have to kind of scope this out here is add this create HTML plugin, which is kind of a little bit odd as you're doing this, but it's because it can do a bunch of other things that I'm not going to show you how to do because I haven't done them before myself. But I do want to just minify it, and this is what I typically do when I'm doing Tailwind projects that also use Vite. Now you'll notice that this is in a vite.config.ts file, which is not installed by default, at least the way that we set up this project. So what I can do is just say touch vite.config.ts. If I do that, I should be able to open up the sidebar here, and here it is right here. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is actually just copy all of this and paste it in right here. Now I am not, let's close the sidebar here, I'm not using view, so I don't need that. And that also means I can get rid of this right here. And now let's close this whole thing out properly. All right, so if I did that correctly, just added all those brackets and parentheses correctly, then I should be able to come in here and now type pnpm run build, or if you're using npm, npm run build works fine as well. You'll see that it processes all of that, and if I open up the sidebar, now I've got this dist folder, and now you'll see here that everything is compressed. Now just to prove that it's actually doing something, let me go ahead and get rid of all of this, and then let's run the same command again. And if I come over here and open this up again, you'll see that none of that space has been removed. So that's how you'd actually do it, and that proves that something's actually happening. All right, so let's shut those two things down, and now let's walk through how to compress the CSS just a little bit more. First of all, if I come over to the Tailwind docs, it actually walks you through this exact process. It says, hey, here's how you can optimize for production. Now, they show you how to do it with the Tailwind CLI. Since we're using PostCSS, though, we're going to work on this PostCSS plugin. Now, one quick note, it says here, if you're using a framework, check the documentation, as sometimes this is handled for you automatically, so you may not even need to do this, and there is a way to do this with Vite itself, but trying to show you both Vite and then also how to use PostCSS, since you don't have to be using Vite to get the benefits of Tailwind, since it's installed using and run using PostCSS. So I'm just going to show you how to minify it here. They also talk about how you can compress it as well, but let's just work on this, and if I clicked here, it would pull me up on the CSSnano doc page. And you'll see that as you walk through here, they give you different ideas of how you can use it. But the real short of the matter is you just have to install CSSnano and then basically add it as a plugin to your config file. So let's come back over here. Let's clear this out. And again, I'm using PNPM. You could be using NPM. That works just fine. But I'm going to say which for is install, and then CSSnano. And then I'll do a capital D like that to do save dev. So this makes it a dev dependency, and it will be tracked in my package.json. Now there are actually a bunch of plugins you can use with CSSnano. I'm not going to do anything complicated here. All I'm wanting to do is to compress this slightly using kind of the defaults. So here they're showing you how to do it in your PostCSS file. You're just going to pass it in as a plugin. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, I do already have a PostCSS config file because that's how Tailwind is configured. So now all I have to do is come in here and say CSSnano, like that. Now for me, the preset that I use is just default, which is the default preset. In fact, there are some documentation here on their site for presets themselves. They talk about how they work. And basically, they're technically named like CSSnano preset, whatever, so default in this case, which is this NPM package right here. So CSSnano preset default, but assuming that this is prefixed, all you have to do is give it the name after that final dash, which in this case is default. And I'll leave the docs for this as well below so you can actually configure this a bit. So for instance, discarding comments, you can say remove all true and give it a bunch of different things. And here are the different ways that you can change and optimize this default as well. There are more advanced use cases as well underneath the presets, but again, this should work pretty basic for us. Now with this as part of my PostCSS config file, I'm going to go ahead one more time and say pmpm run build. You can see here pmpm gives me this readout here of 21.22 kilobytes, and then gzipped it's 4.83. So here is kind of the final build size file. It's actually not that much smaller because the file itself is already so small it's just a single page app. When I did a comparison of just characters that it saved, it's actually about 42% smaller in characters from what comes default with Tailwind. The normal Tailwind process actually won't include everything by default now that everything is run through a just-in-time engine when you compile. However, since I installed that Forms plugin, if you watched the last video, it did include all of that by default because that's not part of Tailwind as it normally is built. Hopefully that makes sense, but basically I saved about 42% of my characters by running it through this CSSnano. I hope this was a help. I know I had a couple of people ask when I mentioned in the last video that you can actually compress some of this more with some tools afterwards. Some people asked for a video following up, so here it is. Well, thanks so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one. Happy coding.